Let's get to our panel. Joining us here in Washington is the managing partner of the China-India Institute, Haiyan Wang. Author and commentator Brian Becker is also with us. He hosts Loud and Clear on Radio Sputnik International. Joining us from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He's a political analyst with China Radio International, and Afshin Molavi is a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Thanks. Great to see all of you again. Qinduo, let me start with you in Beijing. This was the 19th Party Congress, a key event, not just in China, but of course for the world as well. It's just finished its work. What, in your view, were its main accomplishments?
Well, I think for me, the major compliment probably are the following two, aspects. First of all, as mentioned by Nathan King, it's really about this fundamental conclusion that China has, the whole situation has changed, and the principal contradiction or the top press issue facing the country is really the ever-growing needs for a better life and the unbalanced and inadequate development of this country. For example, people are demanding for like a better environment, clean water, clean air, but with the development growing speed is still like 6.5, 6.8%. So you do have a hard time to deal with the pollution issue. And also people are asking for better medical service, better educational service, and then the supply from the government side and from the market is less than adequate. Things like these, I think these are the long-term challenges for the government and for the party to handle that. And secondly, is really about the vision. Basically, more than 30 years from now on, until 2020, China is going to become a so-called moderately prosperous country or middle-income country. And then you have a two-stage development plan that is from 2020 to 2035, 15 years. You will build China into a modern socialist country. And then from 35 to in the middle of this century, 2050, that is another 15 years, China will become a great modern socialist country, basically fully developed modern power, I would say.
So, Haiyan Wang, if we look at the 18th Party Congress 5 years ago, and you look at what happened today, what's happening today, rather, what do you see? What are the changes? Where has President Xi taken China?
I think that if you look at the last 5 years' accomplishment, number one is really the anti-corruption campaign. This is very critical. This is a major effort. And the purpose is to uphold the party's integrity, self-cleansing, self-governing. And only that, you can establish the credibility with the Chinese people to lead China forward. That's number one. Two, the ability to maintain a stable growth entering the new normal, medium-high growth, away from the hyper-growth and growth for, at all costs, that kind of a growth model, and without triggering any systemic financial risk. I think to continue to maintain China's growth being the growth engine for the global economy, and I think that is major. In terms of the structural shift, we've seen that over the last 5 years, shifting more to service sector. Service sector is accounting now more than half of China's GDP, and that's achievement. The shift gradually towards more consumption-driven, less investment-driven, although the journey is still very long. And I think that overall we are at, just as President Xi said, at the historical juncture, to enter the deeper water of reform and to take China to the next stage of a much more balanced, much more challenging growth to reach the end goal of 2050 of becoming a developed, modern country.
Afshin, when President Xi opened the Congress, he talked about a new era. He talked about China's place in the world. Let's take a listen to what he said.
This new era will be an era of building on past successes to further advance our cause, and of continuing in a new historical context to strive for the success of socialism with Chinese characteristics. It will be an era that sees China moving closer to center stage and making greater contributions to mankind. Openness brings progress, while self-seclusion leaves one behind. China will not close its door to the world. We will only become more open.
So, Afshin, as we noted, his policy of socialism with Chinese characteristics is now enshrined in the Constitution, the Communist Party Constitution. What does that mean?
Well, you know, it means what Xi Jinping has been talking about for the past year or two, and particularly in foreign policy. It means, you know, openness and a sense that globalization is actually good for the world. And he, you know, what's interesting is when you look at his speech, and if you look at his previous speeches, he's been taking aim at the populism rising in Europe and taking aim at the populism rising in the United States as well. And it's very important to note that, you know, Deng Xiaoping famously said, "Hide your strength and bide your time." This speech that President Xi Jinping gave was not hiding your strength and biding your time. It was a clarion call that China, as he said in his own words, needs to take center stage. And at the end of the day, I think it was a manifestation of the reality. China cannot hide its strength anymore. China is the second largest economy in the world. It is a world power. And this speech was an acknowledgement of China's role on the world stage.
All right, Brian, do you detect more confidence in foreign policy from President Xi Jinping and China?
Well, the Chinese policy is a steady policy, and it's made it clear what its priorities are. And this has been long-term. When you look at U.S. foreign policy, it seems ad hoc. It's bumping from crisis to crisis. An agreement is signed by one president, abrogated by the next president, not just in one field, but a number of fields. You look at China, it's a steady and anchored foreign policy. The goal of the foreign policy is obviously to maintain a policy of peace, because that allows China to rise peacefully. And as a consequence, you see that China has not really fundamentally challenged the United States in regions that the Chinese have decided are fundamental to U.S. design, say the Middle East. But when it comes to the Asia-Pacific, when it comes to the U.S. moving, as it is by 2020, 60% of its naval and air force assets into the region, of course, China perceives that in a threatening kind of way, and China's making it clear we're not backing down from our international obligations. We're not trying to create chaos. We're trying to be a voice of peace, but we're also going to be very strong. And with the update and the modernization of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, asserting again forcefully that it's under the leadership and control of the Communist Party of China, those are the messages that China needs to send, and I think were sent during this Party Congress.
I also think that this confidence is primarily also about confidence in socialism with Chinese characteristics, that the key attribute and the strength of these characteristics of socialism, Chinese way, is the absolute leadership of the Communist Party. I think then there is that confidence that under the leadership of the Communist Party, that China can find its path, can prove that its path of development doesn't have to be a copy version of how the traditional Western countries grow from poor to middle and to rich economies that could prove to be a path, and other developing countries could learn from. There is that utter confidence as well.
But the confidence also, I think, just to jump in really quickly, it's pinned on this, that the party has said we're not going to allow corruption. And Xi Jinping took the leadership on it. It's now enshrined in the Constitution. It's a permanent feature of the party's work. For a ruling party, unlike a struggling party between 1927 and 49 during the long-fought Civil War, where to join the party meant to give your life, to be at a point of absolute sacrifice, a mature party also faces the danger of corruption and corrosion, and that could be lethal to a party. And so I think this was perhaps maybe the biggest advance right now that Xi Jinping has initiated and has now been enshrined in the Constitution.
Right. Qinduo, what are the specific foreign policy challenges that China faces right now?
Well, I think for China, the immediate problem would be like, Korean Peninsula nuclear crisis, and of course, the relationship with the United States. And these two issues are now intertwined with the upcoming visit by President Trump very soon. So China will, again be put on the spot about how it is going to deal with this crisis, and also how it's going to work with the United States. I think the ball right now is somewhat in the court of Washington, because there's a lot of talk of a preemptive strike against North Korea. I think China, has proposed such like a double suspension, meaning U.S. Pause its basically military exercise with South Korea in exchange for the suspension of nuclear tests on the North Korean side. But obviously, both North Korea and Washington have rejected that proposal. So peaceful dialogue still is going nowhere. I think China should be prepared, or probably is prepared, diplomatically and militarily. On the diplomacy, I think China should talk to the U.S. for the final showdown, for the worst, scenario. What if there's a strike from the U.S.? What if there's a real war on the Korean Peninsula? What China and the U.S. should coordinate, and also with other countries like Russia and South Korea. And militarily, China should secure its border with North Korea, and also prepare for, again, other worst scenario, like a nuclear leakage, or there's invasion from the U.S. against North Korea. So what will China react to that? I think there's a lot of pressure on the government side that is to solve this problem, but also, with interests, with the national interests of the Chinese being considered in this whole process.
Right, Afshin, and that leads us to the Chinese military. There's been lots of talk about strengthening the military, modernizing the military. Where do you see that going?
Well, I mean, this goes back to, President Xi's, speech, and I compared it to Deng Xiaoping. I mean, this was not a hide your strength and bide your time speech. This was, he spoke openly about strengthening the military. He said the military is there to fight. And clearly, he has been more robust in his actions in the South China Sea. So when President Trump visits China, clearly not only is North Korea going to be on the agenda, but South China Sea tensions are going to be on the agenda as well. But I think, at the end of the day, if you take the military and you take, what he was saying about, what he talks about economic globalization. Look, we're living in a globalized world here. We need China to be, in Robert Zoellick's famous word, a responsible stakeholder. And Xi Jinping actually spoke to that in his speech as well. So I think that a stronger Chinese military should not instill fear in people, just like a stronger Chinese economy should not instill fear in people. It can actually benefit us all.
Right, but I think the point was made more than once that the Chinese military will not be an aggressor. It'll be there for defensive purposes.
That's right, and certainly that point will be made, and that point needs to be made in Washington as well, because when you talk to defense and military intellectuals in Washington, that's not always the view.
Okay, Qinduo, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think, of course, a lot of attention has been paid to the growing power of the Chinese military over the past, years, especially since 2012, 2010. I think, a lot of people don't understand why China is growing your military so rapidly, or the pursuit of the modernization of this PLA. If you look at the permanent member of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the major powers of the world, so China is the only country which still has a problem of the territorial integrity and also a sovereignty issue. China still faces the challenges of such kind of issue, for example, like Taiwan, and also, of course, we talked about the South China Sea. There's a different view in the South China Sea. From the Chinese side, obviously, what China has done is really about defending its national interests and territorial integrity. So this whole situation is being improved. We can see China's relationship with the Philippine side and with other countries it has improved rapidly. And when it comes to Taiwan, there's a big challenge. The U.S. had this Taiwan Relations Act, Washington and Taiwan. So basically, U.S. promising to defend Taiwan if there's a war. The thing is, for the Chinese side, if you ask the Chinese people anywhere, any city, anyone, people will probably support the government decision to take Taiwan back. If it declares independence, military forces is necessary, and then the Chinese side will go ahead and do that. So that's, I think there's a huge difference in terms of the understanding of the issue. So China do see there's a necessity to grow its military to make sure its territory will be will be remain, the whole intact.
Right.
And so, 1949. Before that, China, was mostly, a victim of being, like Western powers, and the country was not unified. And with China becoming stronger and stronger, so that's one of the priorities. We should solve that problem.
Okay, Haiyan Wang, you want to say?
While modernizing the military is natural, and because China has kept the growth of military spending on par with the GDP spending, and if you look at China's military expenditure at 2% of the GDP, which is really roughly on par with all of the other major countries. What I think about the future, and I think about the great power, I think great power is the combination of hard power and soft power. And the soft power is really the power of culture and power of the ability to build alliances. So the ability to build alliances is one of the critical hallmark of soft power. So to that end, I think that emphasizing that China's wing is good, not just for China but for the world, that we are building towards the common community of goodness for the mankind. I think that message really needs to be emphasized. In order to build the alliances, around China.
So, Brian, let's look at President Xi Jinping. The goal is a great modern socialist country. What are the unique traits that he brings to this task?
Well, he has the tradition of the revolution itself. As we talked about in the beginning, there's a new generation coming in. In many ways, Xi Jinping is a bridge. His family was a principal part of the Chinese Revolution, of the Civil War. He was there during the 1960s. He spent the time in the village during the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, a time period that he said shaped him and something that he holds on to. In other words, he's a bridge, and he's also strong, and also by emphasizing the ideological roots of the party and the commitment to socialism. In other words, these Chinese characteristics of socialism include allowing a market to bloom, and also to integrate China into a world economy which is still dominated by the world capitalist powers, and yet still adhering to socialism and the idea of common property, the idea of balance, the idea of bringing along all those in Chinese society, including those who are developing out of poverty but still what might be considered the have-nots. This is an important part of the Xi Jinping leadership. The fact that he has moved forcefully against corruption, again, something that would be corrosive and lethal for a ruling party that had its roots in revolutionary sacrifice, I think that's a principal function. And the fact that his name, as Nathan mentioned, was enshrined in the party constitution. Only Mao's name, while still living, was enshrined in the constitution, even though Deng Xiaoping. That's a representation that he has not only consolidated his authority, but the projects and the initiative and the thought that he represents have now appeared to be at least consolidated.
Afshin, one of the biggest achievements of the Chinese has been the alleviation of poverty. Yeah. Hundreds of millions of people brought out of poverty. That is going to continue. Where will it go to from here?
I mean, you're absolutely right, Anand. We haven't seen in modern history this level of poverty alleviation, this kind of economic transformation, which is on a scale of multiply 10x of the Industrial Revolution that created modern England. So we haven't seen anything like this, and so. But I think they were quite right to point out, and President Xi was quite right to point out. Well, now we're facing inequality, right? First you go up the ladder, and you have this economic development, you have the poverty alleviation. And then you have inequality, you have uneven development, and these are things that you have to address. But what China also has to address is that China's economic model was built on exports around the world. So President Xi Jinping has noted that there needs to be a more consumer-driven economy. But to that point, I thought it was fascinating that they added the Belt and Road Initiative to the Constitution, because this is about as big and ambitious a foreign policy project as you can find anywhere in the world. And it's vital not only to China's future, but to the future of many of those countries who may get that kind of investment that will build their infrastructure of connectivity.
Yeah, and Wang, looking at those challenges, as Afshin pointed out a moment ago, uneven development, I mean, the president himself acknowledged that there are challenges. He said it's going to be no walk in the park.
Yes, indeed.
How do they address those challenges?
I think that there are some contradictions. Aside from what President Xi has pointed out, the principal contradiction between rising needs for a better life versus the inadequate, unbalanced development, but he defined the broader needs for a better life beyond just satisfying the material needs to include ecologically more beautiful environment, including fairness and justice in terms of governing the country by rule of law, including the fairness to the people and lifting all people out of poverty. So by broadening the needs more broadly, in a way, he has set forward the blueprint for development. That is, that how do we transform the economy by becoming more consumption-driven? You cannot make the economy more consumption-driven if you do not give the middle class and poor people more purchasing power. In a way that you must move the development from the tier 1 cities to more of the minority regions, to more of the rural areas. And then, you facing the aging population, how do you move beyond just relying growth upon workforce growth, but productivity growth? And productivity growth relies on innovation. But how do you stimulate innovation, make the whole economy more innovative, innovation-driven, while maintaining the absolute leadership in some sense and keeping the state-owned enterprises in control of certain dominant economic sectors? So there are some inherent contradictions that really needs to be resolved in the coming decade.
Some formidable challenges you talk about there. Qinduo, let's take one of those challenges, inequality. How does the Chinese leadership close that gap?
Well, I think, for China, the good thing is like probably this is the richest government in the world. So they have this, strong foreign reserve of more than $3 trillion. Of course, you cannot use that foreign reserve on the domestic market, but at least financially, the government is very strong in dealing with those issues. And of course, if you look at the Chinese poverty alleviation efforts, a few people understand that. We talked about the precision, so-called precision poverty alleviation or targeted poverty alleviation. They pair the Chinese officials, a specific official, with a specific village or specific households. You do whatever you can to help those households get out of the poverty. So I do have the confidence that as long as the government is determined to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor, and I think they will achieve that, say in the next 5 years. The gap already, if you look at the research being done by the scholars around the world, the gap is already being narrowed a little bit, but it's continuing to get narrower and narrower. I think especially with this the digital development, China is becoming a cashless society, and the internet development, you can see if you are familiar with the Alibaba, the Taobao market, online market,
right.
A lot of the retailers, they are the young people even from the rural area. They are becoming much better off with their trying with the business model like a couple of years.
Okay.
So we do see a lot of people are catching up with the country.
Okay, that's where we have to end it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.